Hello. Tonight we gather once more in the quiet dark, where the only sounds are the soft crackle of a distant fire and the slow turning of the earth. Imagine the Mongolian steppe at twilight. Vast, open, almost endless. The last light bleeding gold along the horizon, while the first stars already prick the deepening blue above. The wind never quite stops here. It moves through tall grass in long, patient waves, carrying the faint scent of horse sweat, smoke from dung fires, and the sharp iron tang that lingers after violence. This is the world into which a boy named Temujin was born around the year 1162. The steppe in the middle of the 12th century was not a single nation. It was a mosaic of tribes and clans: Mongols, Tatars, Karaite, Naiman, Merkits, and many smaller groups, each fiercely independent, each bound by ancient codes of kinship and revenge. There were no fixed borders, only the shifting lines drawn by grazing rights, water sources, and the strength of a man's bow. Resources were never abundant. A dry summer could turn pasture to dust. A harsh winter could kill half the herds. Survival meant constant movement, constant vigilance, and, very often, constant war. A successful one brought horses, sheep, women, weapons. A failed one brought death, or, worse, enslavement. Blood feuds passed from father to son like heirlooms, sometimes lasting generations until every last male of the offending line was gone. Into this hard place came Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan of the Mongols. He was already called Yesugei Batur, Yesugei the hero, because he had proven himself in battle and in the delicate art of making alliances. One of his most important acts was the abduction of a young woman named Hurlun from the Merkit tribe. In the steppe, such marriage by capture was not uncommon. It was a way to forge ties between groups or simply to take what one could defend. Hurlun had already been promised to another man, but Yesugei and his warriors took her anyway. She became his chief wife, and together they had several children. The eldest surviving son would be Temujin. Yesugei was ambitious. He understood that no single clan could dominate the steppe alone. He sought friends, protectors, and useful kin. One of his most significant alliances was with the powerful Karaite leader Togrul, later known as Ong Khan or Wang Khan. Yesugei pledged loyalty to Togrul in exchange for protection and the promise of mutual aid. It was a pragmatic bond, sealed with oaths and gifts, the kind of relationship that could mean life or death in a land without law beyond the arrow. But alliances were fragile. Around 1171, when Temujin was perhaps 9 years old, Yesugei rode out to arrange a marriage for his son with a girl from another Mongol clan. On the journey home, he stopped at a camp of Tatars' old enemies and accepted their hospitality. The Tatars, recognizing him, poisoned the food. Yesugei returned to his family mortally ill. He died soon after, in agony, leaving Hurlun with 4 young sons, several daughters, and 2 children from Yesugei's first wife. The boy Temujin was now the nominal head of the family, though he was still a child. The moment Yesugei stopped breathing, the fragile web of alliances unraveled. Most of the clan drifted away. The Taichiut, distant relatives who had once followed Yesugei, saw opportunity. They arrived in force, stripped the camp of livestock, servants, and goods, and drove Hurlun and her children into the wilderness. They left behind only a handful of loyal retainers and a few broken horses too weak to be worth taking. The family was reduced to scavenging roots, fishing in shallow streams, and hunting marmots with whatever arrows they could salvage. Hunger became a constant companion. The children learned to shoot small game, to read the signs of edible plants, to endure cold nights with only thin felt blankets between them and the frost. Temujin grew up fast in that crucible. He was strong, quick to anger, and already aware that weakness invited destruction. One of the clearest early memories recorded about him concerns his half-brother Bekta, the eldest son of Yesugei's first wife. Bekta was older, stronger, and increasingly assertive. He began taking the best portions of what little food the family managed to catch. He would not share. Tension built slowly, the way heat builds in dry grass before a spark. One day, after Bekta had again claimed a fish or a bird that should have been divided, Temujin and his full younger brother Karsar decided they had endured enough. They ambushed Bekta near the riverbank and killed him with arrows. When Ho'alun learned what her sons had done, she wept and raged, calling them wild beasts who had turned on their own blood. But the act was done. Bekta's death removed a rival and, in the harsh logic of the steppe, consolidated Temujin's position as the family's protector. That single killing marked something permanent in him. The steppe had already taught him that mercy could be fatal, that trust must be earned slowly and tested often. From those years of exile and near starvation came two intertwined qualities that would define his entire life: an absolute willingness to use cruelty when necessary, and an absolute insistence on loyalty from those who stood beside him. He learned early that friends could become enemies overnight, but that a man who had shared hunger and danger with you was worth more than gold. Those lessons, carved deep during childhood, never left him. The wind keeps moving across the grass tonight, carrying the same scents it carried, then horse, smoke, iron. Somewhere in that long-ago dusk, a boy sharpened his first real arrows, watched his mother mend torn felt, and understood that the world would never give him anything he did not take. And so the path began. One quiet, determined step at a time, toward a name the world would never forget. The wind that once carried the scent of a boy's first sharpened arrows now moved across the same steppe, carrying the low voices of men planning escape. After years of scraping survival from roots and small game, Temujin had grown into a young man of perhaps 16 or 17, lean, watchful, already marked by the steppe's hard lessons. The Taichiut, the same group that had stripped his family bare after Yesugei's death, still held sway over parts of the Mongol clans. One spring they captured Temujin during a raid or skirmish. They did not kill him outright. Instead, they fitted him with a heavy wooden kanga, a slave collar, and forced him to serve in their camp. Hauling water, tending horses, enduring mockery, the collar chafed his neck raw. The nights were long and cold, but he watched. He learned their routines, their weak points, who among the guards drank too much kumis. One night, with help from a sympathetic young Taichiut named Sorkan Shira and his family, Temujin slipped the collar, broke free, and ran into the darkness. He hid in a river, breathing through a reed until the search passed. Then he made his way back to the few loyal followers who still remembered his father's name. That escape was more than physical freedom. It was the moment Temujin began to gather men not by right of birth or wealth, but by something stronger. Personal loyalty, earned through shared risk. He did not yet command armies. He commanded trust. One of the first bonds he strengthened was with Jamuka, a childhood friend from a related Mongol lineage. They had played together as boys, racing horses, shooting arrows at targets, sharing stories under the stars. When Temujin was perhaps 11, the two had performed the Anda ceremony, blood brotherhood. They cut their wrists, let the blood drip into a horn of mare's milk, drank it together, and swore to stand as one until death. The Anda bond was sacred on the steppe, stronger than bloodkin in many ways, because it was chosen. Jamuka was clever, charismatic, already respected among his own followers. For a time, the two young men rode together, raiding, hunting, building a small following. They exchanged gifts, slept side by side in the same yurt, spoke of a future where they would rule the steppe together. But even then, the seeds of rivalry were there, two strong personalities, two visions of leadership. Only one can stand at the top. Another early follower came from humbler roots. Bo-Orchu was a young herder who owned nothing but a good horse and a bow. One day, Temujin's small band was attacked, and 8 of his horses were stolen. Temujin tracked the thieves for days with almost no supplies. Bo-Orchu, who had never met him before, saw the pursuit, asked a few questions, then simply joined without being asked. Together they recovered the horses. When Temujin offered him a share, Bo-Orchu refused. He said he had followed because he saw a man worth following. From that day Bo-Orchu stayed, becoming one of the most trusted commanders Temujin would ever have. Steady, brave, never asking for more than his place at the fire. Not every bond began in friendship. Jelmi, from the Uriankai people, first appeared as part of an enemy group. When Temujin's camp was raided, Jelmi was captured. Instead of killing or enslaving him, Temujin saw something useful. The man was skilled with weapons and horses. He offered Jelme freedom if he would serve loyally. Jelme accepted. Over time, he proved himself again and again, rising to become one of the greatest generals of the empire. The steppe rewarded results, not origins. The most important bond, though, was with a woman. When Temujin was still a boy, his father had arranged his betrothal to Berta, daughter of Sechin of the Ongarat tribe. After Yasuge's death, the marriage seemed unlikely to happen, but Temujin, now free from the Taichi Ut, rode to Sechin's camp and claimed his bride. Berta was given to him with a fine sable cloak, as dowry, a valuable gift in a world where warmth meant survival. They married, and for the first time Temujin had a partner who matched his determination. Berta bore him children and managed the household with quiet competence. She became his closest advisor in many ways, but peace was brief. Not long after the marriage, a Merkit raiding party struck in revenge for Yasuge's abduction of Hoelun years before. They overwhelmed the small camp and carried Berta away. Temujin was devastated. He rode to his Anda Jamuka and to his old protector Togrul, the Kharit Khan now called Onkan. Both agreed to help. Together, their combined forces surprised the Merkit camp at night. In the confusion, Berta was rescued, though she had already spent several months in captivity. When she returned, she was pregnant. The boy she later bore was named Jochi, the guest. The name carried a shadow. No one could be certain whether the father was Temujin or one of the Merkit warriors. Temujin accepted the child as his own and never publicly questioned paternity. But the doubt lingered in whispers and in the minds of some followers. It would matter years later. Through these years, Temujin built not an empire, but a core. A handful of men who had seen him hungry, hunted, betrayed, and still chose to stand with him. He gave them respect, shared spoils fairly, remembered their names and their families. In return, they gave him something no title could buy: willingness to die for him. The alliances were still fragile, the steppe still vast and unforgiving. But a center had begun to form around one man who understood that true power starts small, in the quiet moments when one person looks another in the eye and says, "I am with you." Under those same starry skies, the campfires burned low, and the talk turned to what might come next. The same campfires that once warmed small bands of loyal followers now burned brighter, fed by larger herds and the spoils of bigger raids. Temujin had grown from a fugitive into a leader whose name carried weight across the steppe. The alliances he had built through personal oaths and shared hardship gave him a core of fighters who would not break easily. But the steppe was still divided, and two men in particular stood in his way: his old Anda Jamuka and his former protector Onkan. Both had power, followers, and reasons to see Temujin remain a junior partner rather than a ruler. The break with Jamuka came gradually, then all at once. For years, the two blood brothers had ridden together, dividing loot fairly, planning joint campaigns. But as Temujin's following grew faster, drawn by his habit of rewarding merit over birth and sharing hardship equally, Jamuka began to feel the shift. He preferred the old ways: aristocratic privilege, strict hierarchy based on lineage. Temujin was building something new, a system where a shepherd's son could rise if he proved brave and capable. The tension surfaced in small ways at first: disagreements over strategy, who should lead which raid, then hardened into open rivalry. In 1201 or so, Jamuka gathered a coalition of 13 tribes against Temujin, calling himself Gur Khan, universal ruler. They met at the Battle of Dalan Baljut. Jamuka's forces outnumbered Temujin's, but Temujin used the terrain cleverly, drawing the enemy into a narrow valley where their greater numbers worked against them. His men held discipline, struck hard, then withdrew in good order. Jamuka's coalition fractured under the strain. Many of his allies slipped away after the defeat, some quietly joining Temujin instead. Jamuka himself escaped, but the Anda bond was broken beyond repair. Years later, in 1204, 1205, Jamuka's position became desperate. His last followers betrayed him, delivering him bound to Temujin. The two men faced each other one final time. Temujin did not mock or torture his old friend. He reminded Jamuka of their boyhood oaths, of the days they had shared milk and blood. Then he offered him a place at his side again. Jamuka refused. He asked only for a death without bloodshed, noble execution, so his spirit could join his ancestors without shame. Temujin granted the request. Jamuka was wrapped in felt and trampled by horses, a traditional but merciful end for a man of high status. No blood was spilled on the ground. The earth was not offended. With that act, Temujin removed his most dangerous rival and demonstrated to everyone watching that he could be both ruthless and honorable. Ong Khan, the Kerit leader who had once sheltered Temujin, presented a different challenge. The old man had grown suspicious of his young vassal's rising power. Influenced by his son Sengum and other courtiers who feared losing influence, Ong Khan broke the alliance. In 1203, he launched a surprise night attack on Temujin's camp. Temujin was caught off guard. Many of his people were killed or scattered. He escaped with a small group, retreating to a remote hill called Baljuna. There, in one of the lowest moments of his life, he and his followers drank from a muddy lake and swore renewed oaths of loyalty. The Baljuna covenant became legendary proof that even in defeat, Temujin's core never wavered. He rebuilt quickly. Using intelligence from defectors and scouts, he struck back the next year. In a series of hard-fought engagements, he shattered the Kurite forces. Ong Khan fled westward and was later killed by Naiman warriors, who mistook him for an enemy. His head was brought to Temujin. The old protector's line ended. The Kerit were absorbed into Temujin's growing confederation. With the Kerit gone, the Naiman and remaining Tatar groups were next. The Naiman, under their Khan Taiyang, had a strong army and Chinese-style advisors. In 1204, Temujin crushed them at the Battle of Chakirmaut, using feigned retreats to lure their forces into disorder. Then closing the trap, Taiyang was killed. His son Kuchlug escaped but would be dealt with later. The Tatars, longtime enemies responsible for Yesugei's death, were systematically hunted down in a campaign of retribution. Temujin ordered the execution of every male taller than a cart axle, old enough to draw a bow while sparing women and children. The policy was brutal but calculated. It eliminated future avengers while incorporating survivors into his own ranks. By 1206, the steppe was quieter than it had been in generations. Almost all the major tribes, those not destroyed outright, had submitted or allied. In that year, at a great assembly on the banks of the Onon River, the tribes gathered in their thousands. They raised white banners, beat drums, and proclaimed Temujin supreme ruler. They gave him the title Genghis Khan, often translated as universal ruler or oceanic Khan, suggesting a lordship as vast and boundless as the sea. The title was more than honor. It carried the weight of heavenly mandate. The Mongols believed in Tengri, the eternal blue sky, who granted victory to the worthy and withdrew favor from the weak. By uniting the tribes under one banner, Genghis Khan claimed that Tengri had chosen him to bring order to the chaos of the steppe and, ultimately, to the world beyond. At the same Kurultai, he issued the first elements of what would become the Great Yasa, his code of laws. It was not yet complete, but the foundations were laid. Strict penalties for theft, adultery, and desertion, protection for envoys and merchants, equality before the law regardless of tribe, prohibition of quarrels during battle. He reorganized the army on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 tumen, breaking old tribal loyalties and tying men directly to commanders chosen for ability. He created the Kashik, his personal guard of 1,000 men, selected from the sons of his most trusted followers. They served in rotation, ate from his table, and formed the nucleus of an elite force that answered only to him. The Kurultai ended with feasts, horse races, and the distribution of captured wealth. But the real significance lay in the silence that followed the proclamations. A vast gathering of former enemies now standing together under one name, one sky, one purpose. The fractured steppe had become something new, a people ready to move outward. And as the last fires died down along the Onon, the horizon no longer held only old rivals. It held distant cities and empires that had never heard the name Genghis Khan. As the last fires died down along the Onon, and the new title of Genghis Khan settled over the united tribes like a fresh blanket of snow, the real work of empire began. What had been a loose confederation of clans now had to become an instrument capable of projecting power far beyond the steppe. The Mongol army that emerged in those years was not invincible because of superior numbers or because fate favored one side. It was unstoppable because Genghis Khan and his commanders built a system, a machine of men, horses, information, and will that operated with precision few armies in history have matched. Discipline came first and never wavered. Every warrior knew the rules. Leave the camp in perfect order. Never break ranks without orders. Never loot until the commander gave permission. Breaking these rules meant death, often immediate and public. A man who fled battle was executed. One who deserted his unit was hunted down. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the only way to keep cohesion when thousands of men, many of them former enemies, moved together at speed across open country. The decimal organization helped enforce it. Each unit of 10 answered to its leader. 10 units formed 100, 10 hundreds 1,000, 10 thousands a tumen. Commanders were chosen for proven ability, not noble birth. A shepherd who showed courage and skill could rise to command thousands. Loyalty flowed upward to the Khan, but competence earned the position. The Mongols' favorite tactic was the feigned retreat. It looked simple. The front line would charge, clash briefly, then turn and ride away as if broken. The enemy, seeing victory, would pursue, often breaking their own formation in the excitement. The retreating Mongols kept perfect order, riding just fast enough to stay out of reach, but slow enough to lure the pursuers deep. At a prearranged signal, they would wheel around in small groups, shower the disorganized enemy with arrows, then close in from the flanks. The classic maneuver was the Mangudai suicide attack, where a small force would deliberately provoke and then draw the enemy into a larger trap. Combined with the classic steppe encirclement, called the crow hunt or nurge, it turned pursuit into slaughter. The Mongols did not rely on brute force head-on clashes. They preferred to make the enemy come to them on unfavorable terms. Mobility was the foundation of everything. Each warrior rode with at least 3 to 5 remounts, spare horses that carried light loads of dried meat, mare's milk, tools, and spare arrows. The army could cover up to 100 kilometers in a day for short bursts, sustaining that pace longer than any infantry-based force. Horses were small but incredibly hardy, bred to survive on grass alone, even in winter. Riders changed mounts frequently, keeping both man and beast fresh. This allowed rapid concentration of force. Separate columns could march on wide fronts, then converge suddenly on a target the enemy thought safe. Logistics were minimal and ruthless. No heavy supply trains followed. The army lived off the land, requisitioned from locals, or carried enough dried provisions for weeks. When grazing was poor, they bled their horses lightly and drank the blood mixed with milk. Intelligence made the difference between surprise and stalemate. Genghis Khan turned trade into espionage. Merchants moving along the Silk Road routes were encouraged and sometimes compelled to report what they saw. Troop numbers, city defenses, harvests, morale. Defectors and prisoners were interrogated carefully. Scouts rode far ahead, sometimes weeks in advance, mapping water sources, passes, and weak points. Before any major campaign, the Khan knew more about the enemy than the enemy knew about itself. Psychological warfare was deliberate and merciless. The message was consistent. Resistance brings total destruction. Surrender brings life, and often privilege. Cities that fought to the last were razed, populations massacred or enslaved, skulls piled in pyramids as warnings. Those that opened their gates kept their lives, property, and often their administrators. Artisans, engineers, and useful craftsmen were spared and relocated to serve the Mongols. The policy was not random sadism. It was calculated terror designed to minimize future resistance. Word traveled fast along trade routes. A city that heard what happened to the last one to defy the Khan often chose submission before the first arrow flew. The Mongols were pragmatists with technology. They had no native tradition of siege warfare. Steppe nomads rarely needed to take fortified cities. But they learned quickly. After early campaigns against the Jin dynasty, they incorporated captured Chinese siege engineers who knew how to build traction catapults, counterweight trebuchets, and battering rams. Later, from Muslim engineers in Central Asia, they adopted gunpowder weapons, early bombs, and fire lances, though these were supplementary. The real advantage was speed of adaptation. They took what worked from every enemy and made it their own without pride or prejudice. Two men embodied this system better than most. Sube'etei, born to a blacksmith's family, rose through sheer talent to become the greatest strategist Genghis Khan ever employed. He commanded independent campaigns across thousands of kilometers, coordinated multiple armies by messenger, and won battles against numerically superior foes through maneuver and timing. Jebei, originally named Jirko Ardai, had once shot Genghis Khan's horse from under him in battle. Captured, he admitted the deed and asked only to serve. Genghis Khan renamed him Jebei, Arrow, and gave him command. Together, Sube'etei and Jebei led the famous Great Raid of 1,219-1,223, circling the Caspian Sea, defeating the Georgians, Cumans, and Rus princes at the Kalka River, then returning home after a journey of more than 10,000 kilometers, all without major defeat. Their campaigns showed what the Mongol system could do when given free rein: cover vast distances, strike unexpectedly, and vanish before retaliation could form. This was no accident of brave individuals. It was a machine built piece by piece: discipline to hold formation, mobility to choose the battlefield, intelligence to know the enemy, terror to break his will, merit to promote the capable, and openness to learn from anyone. Ordinary riders, raised on horse and bow, became the most effective soldiers of their age because the system around them multiplied their strengths and minimized their weaknesses. In the quiet hours after a victory, when the dust settled and the cries faded, the survivors would look across the plain and see not just bodies, but the shape of something new, an army that moved like wind and struck like thunder, carrying the name of one man to the edges of the known world. And that name was already being carried farther still, toward walls and gates that had never imagined such a storm. As the horizon no longer held only old rivals but distant cities and empires that had never heard the name Genghis Khan, the newly proclaimed Khan turned his gaze southward. The steppe had been united under one banner, but true power required more than control of grass and herds. It required confronting the settled worlds that bordered the nomads' worlds of walls, rice fields, written records, and wealth measured in silver rather than horses. The first of these was the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia, known to the Mongols as Xixia, and beyond it the much larger Jin dynasty that ruled northern China. The motive was partly revenge. For generations the Mongols had paid tribute to stronger neighbors. The Jin emperors had played tribes against each other, supported rivals to keep the steppe divided, and demanded annual gifts of horses, furs, and falcons from Mongol leaders, including Yesugei's own clan. The Tanguts of Xixia had done much the same, raiding Mongol pastures when they could, and extracting submission when they could not. Genghis Khan saw these humiliations as debts unpaid. He would collect them, not just in loot, but in recognition that the steppe no longer bowed. The campaign against Western Xia began in 1205 with probing raids, then escalated in 1209 into a full invasion. The Tanguts had fortified cities, irrigation canals, and a disciplined army that included heavy cavalry and crossbowmen. Genghis Khan's forces were not yet masters of siegecraft. They suffered early setbacks, including a failed assault on the capital Yinchuan, where the Yellow River was diverted to flood the Mongol camp instead of the city. But the Mongols adapted. They captured engineers and laborers, learned to build ladders and rams, and used captured Tangut soldiers to fill moats with bundled reeds and earth. After months of pressure, the Tangut king submitted in 1210, offering his daughter in marriage to Genghis Khan, tribute in camels and silk, and troops to serve in future campaigns. The kingdom was spared total destruction for now and became the first vassal state to pay regular tribute rather than being erased. The lesson was immediate and valuable. Destruction brought short-term gain, but preservation brought long-term control. Cities could be milked for artisans, administrators, and revenue if their people were allowed to live and work. Genghis Khan began to spare useful populations systematically: blacksmiths, weavers, physicians, scribes. They were relocated to Mongol camps or new settlements where their skills served the growing empire. With Western Xia humbled, attention turned to the Jin dynasty. The Jin, descendants of the Jurchen who had conquered northern China from the Song, ruled a vast territory with millions of subjects, massive armies, and the great city of Zhongdu, modern Beijing, as its capital. The Jin had long treated the Mongols with contempt, referring to them as barbarians and demanding tribute. In 1211, Genghis Khan formally ended all relations, ritually poured water on the ground as a sign of breaking oaths, and launched what would become a 20-year war. The opening campaign was devastating. Mongol Tumans crossed the Gobi in multiple columns, avoiding the main Jin fortresses by using lesser-known passes scouted years in advance. They struck deep into Jin territory, burning villages, seizing herds, and forcing the Jin field armies to chase shadows. The Jin relied on heavy infantry and fortified positions. The Mongols refused to stand and fight on those terms. Instead, they used speed and dispersal to wear the enemy down. In 1213, 1214, the Mongols encircled Zhongdu itself. The siege lasted nearly a year. The city was immense, surrounded by triple walls and moats, defended by hundreds of thousands. The Mongols built siege engines with captured Chinese engineers, catapults that hurled stones and incendiary bombs, movable towers, underground tunnels. They cut supply lines, starved the garrison, and spread disease through captured prisoners driven toward the walls. In 1215, Zhongdu fell. The Jin emperor had already fled south to Kaifeng, leaving the capital to its fate. The Mongols entered the city after a final betrayal by a defending general. Much of the population was massacred in the initial sack, though artisans and skilled workers were again spared and deported northward. The fall of Zhongdu sent shockwaves through the settled world. Chroniclers in China, Korea, and farther west described the invaders as steppe demons, horsemen who appeared from nowhere, killed without mercy, and vanished like smoke. The terror was real, but it was also policy. The reputation for invincibility reduced the need for future battles. Yet even amid the destruction, Genghis Khan showed signs of evolution. He began to listen to men who understood empires rather than just raids. One of the most important was Yelu Chukai, a Khitan noble captured during the Jin campaign. Yelu was a scholar, astronomer, and poet who had served the Jin court. When brought before Genghis Khan, he refused to kneel fully, explaining that he served only through heaven's will. The Khan, intrigued rather than angered, kept him close. Yelu Chukai became an advisor, gently insisting that conquest was easy on horseback, but governance required different skills. He argued against mass slaughter of northern Chinese peasants, pointing out that dead farmers paid no taxes. "You can conquer an empire on horseback," he reportedly said, "but you cannot rule it from horseback." Genghis Khan did not adopt all his ideas at once, but the presence of such men marked a shift. The Khan began to see value in taxation, census-taking, and administration over pure plunder. The war with Jin continued in phases. After Zhongdu, the Mongols withdrew to consolidate, leaving the Jin weakened but still fighting. They returned in force later, but the initial campaigns taught the Mongols how to reduce great cities, how to use local knowledge against empires, and how to extract wealth without killing the source. Western Xixia too would rebel again years later, but the pattern was set. Submission brought survival and a place in the new order. Defiance brought ruin. In those southern lands, amid the clamour of falling ramparts and the distant cries of refugees, the conqueror who had once fought for survival on the open grass was learning to think like a ruler of cities and fields. The steppe had given him the will to take. The settled world was teaching him how to keep. And as the smoke from Zhongdu drifted northward on the wind, new horizons opened farther west, where another empire waited rich, proud, and unaware of the storm already gathering strength. As the smoke from Zhongdu drifted northward on the wind, new horizons opened farther west, where another empire waited rich, proud, and unaware of the storm already gathering strength. The Khwarazmian Empire stretched from the edges of the Caspian Sea through the fertile oases of Transoxiana to the mountains of Afghanistan and the Indus Valley. Under Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, it was one of the wealthiest and most populous states of its time, controlling the heart of the Silk Road trade. Its cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, were centres of learning, commerce, and architecture, filled with madrasas, caravanserais, and markets that drew merchants from as far as India and the Volga. The Shah himself held the title of Second Alexander, a claim to universal dominion that echoed the ambitions of his predecessors. He had recently expanded his realm by defeating the Kara Kitai and absorbing their territories, bringing him into indirect contact with the new Mongol power to the east. The first contact was commercial, not military. In 1218, a large caravan of Mongol merchants, perhaps 400 or 500 men, accompanied by 100 camels laden with goods, arrived at the border city of Otrar. The governor, Inalchuk, known as Genghis Khan, was a relative of the Shah's mother and a man of considerable authority in the region. For reasons that remain unclear, greed, suspicion of spies, or simple arrogance, he accused the merchants of being Mongol spies. He seized the caravan, imprisoned the traders, and executed most of them. A few escaped and carried the news back to Genghis Khan. The Khan reacted with measured restraint at first. He sent 3 ambassadors to the Shah, 2 Muslims and 1 Mongol, demanding the surrender of Inalchuk for punishment and compensation for the murdered merchants. The demand was framed as justice under the steppe code, a life for a life, restitution for theft. Shah Muhammad, already paranoid from court intrigues and rumours of Mongol strength, saw the embassy as an insult to his sovereignty. He had 1 ambassador beheaded, and the beards of the other 2 burned off before sending them back in humiliation. The message was unmistakable. The Shah would not submit to demands from a steppe nomad. That act turned a border incident into a casus belli. Genghis Khan assembled his forces in the winter of 1220. He did not rush. Preparations were thorough. Scouts mapped the mountain passes and river crossings. Engineers gathered siege equipment learned from the Jin campaigns. Alliances were secured with vassals like the Uyghurs and the subdued Tanguts. When spring came, the main army estimated at 150,000 to 200,000 men. Though exact numbers vary, moved west in several independent columns. This was the strategic genius of the campaign. Instead of a single massive thrust that could be met and contained, Genghis Khan divided his forces so they could strike simultaneously at multiple points across a front hundreds of kilometers wide. The Shah, with perhaps 400,000 troops scattered in garrisons, could not concentrate quickly enough to counter all threats at once. The first major target was Otrar itself. The city held out for 5 months under Inalchuk's command. When it finally fell in 1220, the governor was captured alive. Genghis Khan ordered him executed by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears, a deliberate echo of the greed that had started the war. The population was divided. Artisans and useful craftsmen were spared and sent east. The rest were killed in the systematic manner that had become policy for defiant cities. From Otrar, the Mongols advanced on Bukhara. The city surrendered after a brief siege in early 1220. Genghis Khan entered personally, rode to the main mosque, and addressed the assembled notables from the pulpit. He declared himself the scourge sent by God to punish their rulers' arrogance. The city was looted, but not razed. Its scholars and craftsmen were deported northward. Samarkand followed soon after. The Shah had reinforced it with a large garrison, but morale collapsed under news of other defeats. After a short bombardment and the usual feigned retreats to draw out sorties, the city gates opened. Again, the pattern. Skilled workers spared, the rest massacred or enslaved, the treasury seized. The Shah himself fled westward, abandoning his capitals one by one. He hoped to rally forces in the west, but his own governors began to defect or surrender. Urgench, the old capital on the Amu Darya, became the scene of the campaign's most methodical destruction. The Mongols besieged it for months in 1221. When it fell, the victors diverted the river to flood parts of the city, then systematically slaughtered the inhabitants over several days. Estimates run as high as 1 million dead, though such figures are almost certainly inflated. Still, the scale of killing was immense. The city was left in ruins, its canals destroyed, its libraries burned or scattered. The destruction of Khwarazm was not impulsive rage. It was calculated. Remove the Shah's power base, break the will of any future resistance, and leave a warning that would echo across Asia. Shah Muhammad escaped to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died of illness or pneumonia in late 1220, a fugitive king stripped of everything. His son Jalal ad-Din continued the fight, winning a few battles through daring raids, but he could not reverse the tide. He eventually fled to India, where he lived as an exile until his death years later. While the main army crushed the core of Khwarazm, Genghis Khan detached 2 of his best commanders, Subedai and Jebe, for a reconnaissance in force. In 1220 they were sent with perhaps 20,000 men to pursue the fleeing Shah and explore the lands beyond. They chased Muhammad across northern Iran, then swung north through the Caucasus. In 1221, 1222, they defeated the Georgians, Cumans, and Alans in a series of running battles. In 1223 they reached the southern Russian steppes and met a coalition of Rus's princes and Cuman Khans at the Kalka River. The Mongols used their classic tactics, feigned retreat to lure the heavy Rus cavalry into disorder, then encirclement and archery from horseback. The victory was complete. Several Rus princes were captured and crushed under a wooden platform during a Mongol feast. A ritual humiliation rather than direct bloodshed. Subedai and Jebe then turned east, completing a circuit of more than 7,000 kilometers before rejoining the main army. The raid demonstrated the reach of Mongol power and gathered intelligence on Eastern Europe that would prove invaluable later. The Khwarazmian campaign marked the moment when the Mongol conquests became known in the Islamic world and beyond as something apocalyptic. Chroniclers wrote of rivers of blood, pyramids of skulls, cities turned to ash. The terror was not incidental. It was the instrument. By making resistance seem suicidal and surrender the only rational choice, Genghis Khan ensured that future campaigns would meet less organized opposition. The empire expanded not just through force but through the psychology of inevitable defeat. In the years that followed, the name of Genghis Khan carried a new weight in distant courts from Baghdad to Delhi to the courts of Europe. He was no longer merely a steppe conqueror. He was a force that could reach across continents, destroy ancient kingdoms in a single season, and vanish, leaving silence where cities once stood. And as the dust settled over the ruined oases, the Khan turned once more to the tasks of rule, knowing that conquest alone would not hold what had been taken. As the dust settled over the ruined oases, and the last echoes of battle faded into the vast silence of Central Asia, Genghis Khan faced a different kind of challenge. The empire now stretched from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, religions, and ways of life. Conquest had been achieved through speed, discipline, and terror. Holding it together required something else entirely: structure, predictability, and the ability to govern without constant war. The Khan, who had spent most of his life in the saddle, began the work of turning a nomadic warband into a functioning state. The cornerstone of this effort was the Great Yasa, the code of laws he began to formalize after the 1206 Kurultai and expanded in the years that followed. The Yasa was not a single written document at first. Much of it was transmitted orally and recorded later, but it functioned as a supreme law that overrode tribal customs wherever they conflicted. It covered military organization, criminal justice, civil matters, and even social conduct. Theft was punished severely, often with death, because in a mobile society where property moved on four legs, trust in ownership was essential. Desertion from the army or betrayal of a comrade carried the same penalty. The Yasa protected envoys and merchants explicitly. Harming a caravan or an ambassador was treated as an attack on the Khan himself. This protection extended across the empire, making long-distance trade safer than it had been in generations. One of the most practical innovations was the YAM, the postal and relay system. Stations were established every 20 to 40 kilometers along major routes, each equipped with fresh horses, food, and shelter. Official couriers carrying messages sealed with the Khan's tamga could change mounts and ride day and night, covering hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days. The system served military intelligence, administration, and commerce alike. Merchants used it under strict rules, paying fees but gaining security and speed. The YAM turned the empire's enormous distances from a liability into an advantage, allowing rapid response to rebellion, quick transfer of taxes, and the movement of skilled workers and officials where they were needed. Religious tolerance was another deliberate policy. The Mongols followed Tengri worship and shamanistic practices, but Genghis Khan saw no value in forcing conversion. The Yasa granted freedom of belief to Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, and others, provided they obeyed civil law and paid taxes. Clergy of all faiths were often exempted from tribute and labor duties, a pragmatic move that won cooperation from religious leaders who could influence their followers. This openness contrasted sharply with the intolerance found in many contemporary states and helped prevent widespread religious revolts in newly conquered territories. Guiding much of this transformation was Yelu Chukai, the Khitan scholar who had entered the Khan's service during the Jin campaigns. Yelu was a Confucian-trained administrator who understood bureaucracy and taxation. He accompanied Genghis Khan on the Khwarazm campaign and afterward became a constant presence at court. His most famous advice: "You conquered the empire on horseback, but you cannot govern it from horseback." He argued for a census to assess population and wealth, for fixed tax rates instead of arbitrary plunder, and for the preservation of settled agriculture rather than turning farmland into pasture. Genghis Khan listened, though not always immediately. Under Yelu's influence, the Mongols began to collect regular tribute in silk, grain, and silver, rather than relying solely on one-time sacks. Yelu also helped curb some of the worst excesses. He reportedly saved thousands of northern Chinese lives by convincing the Khan that dead subjects produced no revenue. To make administration possible across linguistic divides, the Mongols adopted the Uyghur script for writing Mongolian. The Uyghurs, early allies, provided literate secretaries who adapted their alphabet to the Mongol language. This created a written medium for edicts, tax records, and military orders. Decrees could now be sent in multiple copies to distant governors, reducing misunderstandings and corruption. The empire was divided administratively into regions overseen by Darugachi governors responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and reporting to the central court. These officials were often chosen from outside the local population to prevent favoritism. Though trusted locals were sometimes retained, the system blended steppe traditions with elements borrowed from China, Persia, and Central Asia. Most importantly, Genghis Khan actively promoted international trade. The Silk Road, long disrupted by wars and banditry, came under Mongol protection. Caravans moved with yam escorts when needed. Merchants paid moderate tolls but enjoyed unprecedented safety. The Pax Mongolica, as later historians called it, allowed goods, ideas, and technologies to flow freely from China to the Middle East and beyond. Spices, silk, porcelain, paper, gunpowder recipes, and medical knowledge travelled westward. Horses, furs, amber, and slaves moved east. In these quieter years, the man who had once killed his brother over a fish now sat in felt tents or captured palaces, listening to scholars, signing decrees, and building something that could outlast his own life. The destroyer had become a builder not out of sentiment, but because he understood that empire without order was only temporary plunder. And as the trade routes hummed with life once more, the Khan's thoughts turned eastward again, to unfinished business that still demanded his attention. As the trade routes hummed with life once more and the empire settled into patterns of tribute and administration, Genghis Khan turned his attention eastward again. The unfinished business lay with the Tanguts of western Xixia. Years earlier they had submitted after the 1210 campaign, sending tribute, troops, and even a royal princess to become one of the Khan's wives. But when the great campaign against Khwarazm began, the Tangut king Li Wang refused to send the requested auxiliary forces. He sent excuses instead, claiming internal troubles. To the Mongols this was not mere absence. It was open defiance, a betrayal from a vassal who had once knelt. Genghis Khan did not forget. In the summer of 1226, now in his early 60s and showing signs of age, stiffer joints, occasional shortness of breath, he assembled an army once more and marched south against western Xixia. The campaign was swift and punishing. The Mongols crossed the Gobi again, struck the northern cities first, then turned toward the capital Yinchuan. The Tanguts fought hard, using their fortified positions and irrigation works to slow the advance. But the Mongol machine had grown more efficient. Siege engines battered walls, engineers diverted rivers to flood defenses, and Tumans encircled supply lines. One by one the major cities fell. The Tangut king, cornered in Yinchuan, sued for peace. Genghis Khan accepted the surrender on condition that the king come in person to submit, bringing his family and senior officials. While negotiations continued outside the city walls, the Khan suffered a serious injury. Accounts differ. Some say he fell from his horse during a hunt, others during battle, but the fall broke ribs or caused internal damage. He was already weakened by years of hard riding, old wounds, and the cumulative strain of decades in the field. Pain grew worse. Fever set in. Yet he refused to withdraw. He directed operations from his tent, issuing orders through trusted commanders. In August 1227, as the siege tightened and victory was certain, Genghis Khan died. The exact date is usually given as August 18 or 25, though Mongol sources kept it vague. The cause was likely complications from the injury, combined with illness, perhaps pneumonia or infection. He was about 65. His death was kept secret for days, perhaps weeks, to prevent the Tanguts from taking heart or the army from losing momentum. Messengers carried the news only to his closest kin and generals. The place of burial remains one of history's enduring mysteries. According to tradition, his body was carried back north in secrecy. A large funeral escort travelled to the Burkhan Khaldun mountain region in the Khentiyi range, near his birthplace. There, the burial party killed everyone they met along the route to preserve silence. The grave was dug at night, the Khan laid in a simple coffin or felt wrapping, with his favourite possessions, bow, arrows, horse gear. Then the earth was trampled by horses to erase all traces. Trees were planted or grass sown over the site. No marker was left. Some accounts say slaves who dug the grave were killed afterward to ensure secrecy. To this day, no tomb has been found, and the Mongols themselves guarded the location as sacred. Before his death, Genghis Khan summoned his sons and senior commanders to settle the succession. He had 4 legitimate sons: Jochi, already dead by this time, though his line continued, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tolui. Tradition favoured the eldest surviving son, but Jochi's paternity doubts and his early death complicated matters. Chagatai was strict and capable but abrasive. Tolui was loyal and competent but young. Genghis Khan chose Ögedei as his successor, the third son, as Great Khan. Ögedei was known for steadiness, generosity, and a willingness to listen to advisors. The choice was deliberate. He wanted a ruler who could maintain unity, rather than one driven by personal ambition. Tolui was appointed regent until Ögedei could be formally enthroned at a Kurultai. The other brothers received large appanages territories to govern under the overall Khan, but the supreme title passed to Ögedei. The Khan's final order was uncompromising. He instructed that Western Shah be utterly destroyed. No mercy for the royal family, no preservation of the state. After his death, the army carried out the command. The Tangut king and his court were executed upon formal surrender. Yinchuan was sacked, its population massacred or deported, its fields ruined, its name erased from official records. The kingdom vanished as an independent entity, reduced to a depopulated region under Mongol governors. In those last days, as fever clouded his mind and the steppe wind moved past the tent flaps, the man who had united tribes and shattered empires completed the cycle of revenge that began with his father's poisoning decades earlier. The betrayal of the Tanguts was answered, the empire's future secured through a chosen heir. Then the silence came, and with that silence the empire passed into the hands of sons who would carry it farther still. With that silence the empire passed into the hands of sons who would carry it farther still. Genghis Khan's death in August 1227 did not fracture the realm he had built. The mechanisms he put in place, the decimal army, the yasa, the yam relays, the merit-based command, held firm. The Kurultai that followed confirmed his choice. Ögedei became Great Khan in 1229, after a brief regency under his younger brother Tolui. The transition was orderly, a testament to the loyalty Chinggis had instilled and the structures he had designed. Jochi, the eldest son, had died in early 27 months before his father. His uncertain paternity from the Merkit abduction of Berta had always cast a shadow, and relations with Chinggis had cooled in the final years. Jochi's ulus, the western territories granted to him, passed to his sons, the most prominent being Batu. Batu inherited his father's command over the steppe lands north of the Caspian and Aral seas, along with the troops stationed there. He would soon become the driving force behind the empire's greatest westward expansion. Chagatai, the second son, received Central Asia and the regions around the old Khwarazmian heartland. Strict and conservative, he took his role as guardian of the yasa seriously. He enforced the laws with rigor, sometimes clashing with brothers who favored flexibility. Chagatai's line would preserve the most traditional Mongol customs long after others adapted to settled ways. Ögedei, the third son and chosen successor, ruled as Great Khan from his new capital at Karakoram. He lacked his father's battlefield ferocity but excelled at organization and diplomacy. Under him the empire reached administrative maturity. He completed the census, begun under Chinggis, standardized taxes, expanded the yam system, and built permanent structures, palaces, storehouses, even a silver tree fountain that dispensed different drinks for guests. Ögedei continued the wars of expansion, but delegated much of the fighting to capable generals, preserving the Khan's life for governance. His reign saw the final subjugation of the Jin remnants and the beginning of larger campaigns in the west and south. Tolui, the youngest, served as regent during the interregnum and received the Mongol homeland as his appanage. Quiet and capable, he commanded respect in the army. He died young in 1232, reportedly sacrificing himself in a shamanistic ritual to cure Ögedei's illness, though poison or natural causes are also suggested. His sons Mönke, Kublai, Hulegu, and Arik Bök would dominate the next generation. Mönke became Great Khan after Ögedei's line faltered. Kublai founded the Yuan dynasty in China. Hulegu established the Ilkhanate in Persia. The most immediate continuation of Genghis Khan's vision came in the west. In 1236, Ögedei launched the Great Western Campaign, placing Batu in overall command with Sube'etei as chief strategist. The Golden Horde, as Batu's ulus came to be known, swept through the Volga Bulgars, the the Cumans, and the Rus principalities. Cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev fell in 1,237, 1,240. The Mongols defeated a combined European force at Legnica in Poland and Mohi in Hungary in 1241. Only the news of Ogedai's death in late 1241 recalled the army eastward for the Kurultai, sparing Central Europe further devastation. The campaign demonstrated the empire's machinery still functioned perfectly. Coordinated tumens, flawless logistics, terror combined with selective mercy. By the 1240s, the Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to northern India. It was no longer held together by one man's charisma alone. The postal relays carried orders in weeks rather than months. Governors reported regularly. Taxes flowed steadily. Trade flourished under protection. Rebellions were rare and swiftly crushed. The sons and grandsons inherited not just territory but a working system that could outlive its founder. In the whispering winds that moved across the steppe, the great Khan's presence lingered not as a ghost, but as the quiet hum of an empire that kept moving forward long after the man who started it had gone still. And in that enduring motion lay the final measure of his life. He had not only conquered, he had created something that could endure. In the quiet reflection of centuries, where history's echoes blend myth with memory, the figure of Genghis Khan stands apart. He is remembered in two sharply different lights. To some, he is the architect of the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, roughly 24 million square kilometers at its peak under his successors, stretching from the Pacific to the edges of Eastern Europe. He united the fractured tribes of the Mongolian steppe after generations of feuding, forging a single people out of clans that had spent centuries raiding one another. Beyond that, he proved a pragmatic administrator. He created laws that applied equally, protected trade across vast distances, tolerated multiple faiths, and built systems, postal relays, censuses, merit-based promotion that allowed an empire of nomads to govern, settled millions. These were not the acts of a mindless destroyer. They were the choices of a man who understood that lasting power requires order. Yet the same man is remembered as a symbol of merciless conquest, the scourge of God, in medieval chronicles, from China to Persia to Russia. His campaigns left cities in ashes, populations decimated, irrigation systems ruined, and libraries burned. The terror he employed was deliberate and effective. It broke resistance before armies even arrived. In the Islamic world, in Eastern Europe, and in parts of China, his name became synonymous with apocalypse. The duality is not contradiction. It is the reality of a leader who used every tool available, brutality when needed, tolerance when useful to achieve his ends. His genetic legacy is measurable. Studies of Y chromosome lineages suggest that roughly 1 in 200 men alive today, about 16 million, carry a marker traced back to him or his close male relatives. In Mongolia, Central Asia, and parts of northern China, the proportion is higher. This spread came from the Khan's own large number of children, the privileges granted to his descendants, and centuries of polygyny among the elite. Culturally, the trace is subtler but no less deep. The Mongol Empire accelerated the exchange of technologies, ideas, and diseases across Eurasia. Gunpowder weapons, paper money, printing techniques, medical knowledge, and even the Black Death moved faster because of the Pax Mongolica. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection in ways it had not before and would not again for centuries. The image of Genghis Khan remains polarized because he embodies extremes that still resonate. In Mongolia, he is the national founder, the father of unity and independence. In many neighboring lands, he is the invader who brought ruin. The polarization keeps him relevant. He represents the question of whether great change can come without great violence, whether unity must be paid for in blood. He was the ultimate product of his environment, the harsh, resource-scarce steppe, where survival demanded absolute loyalty and decisive action. Yet he did not merely survive that environment. He reshaped it, and, through it, the course of Eurasian history for centuries. The fragmented steppe became the launch point for an empire that redrew maps, shifted power balances, and connected worlds that had barely touched before.